Alright, here we're going to learn about the distributive property. So we just learned about combining like terms, which is adding and subtracting like terms, which basically just means it has the same exact variables and exponents. Those are things that you're allowed to add and subtract. Here we're going to be talking about multiplication. So the distributive property is multiplying a number by more than one term inside the parentheses. So we see we have this 4 that's sitting outside this parentheses, which implies multiplication. Anytime we have two numbers that are just next to each other, where one is in parentheses, there's an implication that we're multiplying those numbers. Here, we don't just have one number inside the parentheses, we have two terms inside of there. We have the x and that minus 3. So we're going to distribute the 4 to both of them. We're going to multiply 4 by x and by this negative 3. Really want you to hear the way I said that. It's a negative 3. That sign is a part of that number. You might be viewing that as x minus 3, but it's really also an x and a negative 3. Especially when we deal with this multiplication, we're going to do 4 times x, and actually this isn't really the way I view this. I would think about this as 4 times negative 3, which gives me negative 12. And so in my answer, I write that as minus 12. So 4 times x just becomes 4x. 4 times that negative 3 becomes negative 12. And in my answer, I write that as subtraction. So you want to make sure that you distribute the number outside the parentheses into all terms inside. That's really what it means to distribute. You distribute among everything in the group. And then you really want to be careful with the signs. That's the thing that's going to trip you up. Obviously, we know that it's multiplication. If you're using Desmos, you really shouldn't have any question about whether you're doing that multiplication right. It's just knowing what signs to use. All right, so looking at this first example, we're going to take that 2 and distribute into both terms inside the parentheses. So we're going to do 2 times 4x and 2 times that negative 5. So 2 times 4x and 2 times negative 5. In the beginning, I do want you writing this step. At a certain point, you might lose this step if you're understanding it well enough. But for right now, I do want you to write this step to show that we're multiplying those two sets of numbers. 2 times 4 becomes 8. That keeps the x attached to it. If it started with an x, it's going to keep that x. And then 2 times negative 5 becomes negative 10. So we write that as minus 10 in our answer. And that is all we can do to simplify that expression. One term has an x. This one doesn't. So we can't combine those. Those aren't like terms. That is our simplified answer. On the second one, we see that we have a negative 5 sitting outside the parentheses. So we're distributing a negative number here. So we have to be really careful about the signs. Negative 5 times negative 6x. And then negative 5 times that positive 1. So we're going to do those two multiplication problems. Negative 5 times negative 6 is 30. And again, that's going to keep the x with it. And then negative 5 times positive 1 is a negative 5, so in our answer that's going to show up with a minus sign. That's going to be minus 5 at the end. Again, those are not like terms, so we can't combine them. On the next one, we have a negative 10 that we're distributing into a negative 3 minus 7x, or negative 7x. So negative 10 times negative 3, and separately negative 10 times negative 7x. Negative 10 times negative 3 is 30. Negative 10 times negative 7 is a positive 70. So I write that as plus 70. And again, it keeps its x. Most of the time you'll see this rearranged. You'll see the x term in first, so you'll see 70x plus 30. But to me, these are equivalent. You're fine to write it either way. I'm just going to write it in the order that it's given. So that's 30 plus 70x. Now, number 4, we have one more step. We have this plus 1 at the end, which is not a part of the multiplication. We're going to distribute into everything inside the parentheses, but we don't distribute into that 1. That's not inside the parentheses. That's just being added at the end. So actually, that's going to be my first step. I'm just going to drag that down and rewrite that with my next step, and I'll deal with that later. For right now, I'm just going to distribute negative 3 times 2. That's negative 6. And then negative 3 times negative 2. Negative 3 times negative 2 is a positive 6, and that's going to have the x attached to it. So you can see here, I skipped that middle step. I didn't line these up as separate multiplication problems because I know that I'm just going to multiply with a sign into each of those. I do have one more step. I have to combine like terms. So I have a -6 and a +1. They do not have variables, so they're just constants that I'm allowed to add together. So I'm going to have 6x, that's just going to come down. And then -6 plus 1 is -5. And that is as simple as it gets. Once you've combined all like terms, you know you've simplified it completely. The order is always going to be the same also. You distribute first, and then you combine like terms. It's really following order of operations. You're going to multiply, and then you add and subtract. All right, I'd like for you to try the 4 at the bottom on the front on your own, and I'm going to jump to these. They're a little bit trickier. On each of these, we're just adding another step. Either we're distributing twice, or we're combining like terms. Actually, all of them we're going to combine like terms also. On this first one, I have these two expressions where I'm going to distribute twice. I'm going to take that 5 and distribute into the first set of parentheses. Keep in mind the parentheses end there, so 5 is just multiplied times -4, and then the -1. 5 times -4 is -20x. 5 times -1 is -5. And then separately, I have the 3 that's waiting outside this set of parentheses. That's also going to get distributed. 3 times 5x and 3 times 2. 3 times 5x becomes 15x. 3 times 2 becomes 6. And you can see here I have some x terms and some constant terms that I'm allowed to put together. These two are like terms, and these two are like terms. So I can add those together. -20 plus 15x, -20x plus 15x is -5x. And -5 plus 6 is a +1, so I write that as +1 in my answer. That's as simple as that gets because those are not like terms. You combine all like terms after distributing. On the second one, I have the 5 out in front, and then it says -3 times 8x plus 3 plus 4x. So I have some addition and subtraction that I'm actually not going to worry about in this step. The 5 is going to come down, and the 4x is going to come down. They are not a part of this multiplication step. I'm just going to distribute into the parentheses with the number that's outside the parentheses. That's a -3. Even though you're probably viewing that as 5 minus 3, that sign is attached to that number. It's really a -3 that we're going to distribute into both of these. -3 times 8x and -3 times 3. -3 times 8x is -24x. So I'm going to write that as -24x in my next step. And then -3 times 3 is a -9, so I'm writing that as -9 in that next step. So both of these just come down after I multiply. And now I'm going to combine like terms. I have -24, sorry, I missed the sign on this 4x. That sign stays the same, it's still coming down just as a +4x. I'm going to combine like terms. -24x plus 4x is -20x. 5 minus 9 is -4. Alright, 2 more. This one looks similar to the first one, except we have a negative sign or subtraction in the middle. It's kind of the same thing still, though. We're going to take each of those. The 8 gets distributed into its set of parentheses, and then the -4 gets multiplied into both terms inside that set of parentheses. So we're going to do 8 times -1x. When we don't have a number there, if there is no coefficient, we're just going to use that sign with the number 1. So that's a -1. So it's 8 times -1, or -8x. 8 times -5 is -40, or -40. Then I'm going to take that -4 and distribute it into its set of parentheses. -4 times 2x, and -4 times -4. That is another -4 there. -4 times 2x is -8x. -4 times -4 is a +16, so I write that as +16. And then I get to combine like terms. So -8x minus another 8x, you go down 8, and then you go down another 8. Now we're down to -16x. And then I'm going to combine my constants. That's -40 or -40 plus 16, which gives me a -24. Last one. This is actually similar to what we dealt with here. Actually, it's kind of combining questions 2 and 3. we have the same thing as before, where this negative 10 isn't a part of the multiplication. I'm just going to rewrite that. The plus 4x is also not a part of the multiplication. The only thing that's being multiplied there is the stuff in the parentheses. So I'm just going to drag the rest of that down and deal with it in the next step. The number that's being multiplied here is actually a negative 1. This minus sign is saying that our coefficient there is negative 1. So we're going to distribute negative 1 into both terms inside the parentheses. Negative 1 times 10 is negative 10. Negative 1 times negative 5 is a positive 5x. And then my last step is combining like terms. Negative 10 minus 10 is negative 20. And then 5x plus 4x is 9x. Alright, just like the front, anything I didn't complete in the video, please go and do on your own. If you need to rewatch the video, rewatch it until you get it. Ask for help. Until you fully understand this, we will have an assessment on this next class.